The adult spinal cord measures about 18 inches in length, or 45 centimeters in length, and has a maximum width of about a half inch or 14 millimeters. The cord itself is not as long as the entire spine, and the cord ends at about the levels of L1 and L2 vertebrae. The posterior or dorsal surface of the spinal cord has a shallow groove called the posterior median sulcus that we can see here on the cross-section. The anterior or ventral surface of the spinal cord has a wider groove called the anterior median fissure. In the cross-section, we can also see the distribution of the gray matter versus the distribution of the white matter. The gray matter of the spinal cord is enlarged in areas that are dedicated to the control of the limbs. These enlargements are termed the cervical enlargement that supplies nerves to the shoulder and upper limbs, and the lumbar enlargement that provides innervation to the pelvis and lower limbs. The spinal cord starts to taper and becomes conical just below the lumbar enlargement. This region is termed the conus medullaris. A slender strand of fibrous tissue called the filum terminale extends from the inferior tip of the conus medullaris as far as the second sacral vertebrae, where it provides support to the spinal cord and is a component of the coccygeal ligament. There are some variations in the proportions of gray matter versus white matter in the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions of the spinal cord. Here we can see that the lumbar region has the most amount of gray matter, and the thoracic region has the least amount of gray matter versus the white matter. The entire spinal cord can be divided into 31 segments on the basis of the origins of the spinal nerves. A letter and number will designate the spinal nerve beginning at spinal nerve C1 that exits the intervertebral foramen between the occiput and C1 and ending at the spinal nerve S5 that exits the fifth sacral foramen. Every spinal segment is associated with a pair of dorsal nerve roots and ventral nerve roots. The dorsal root and the ventral root will merge to form the spinal nerve just lateral to the intervertebral foramen. The dorsal nerve carries sensory nerve fibers and the ventral nerve root carries motor nerve fibers. The cell bodies of the dorsal nerve root are clustered in the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion is located between the pedicles of the adjacent vertebrae. Distal to each dorsal root ganglion, the sensory or dorsal and the motor or ventral roots are bound together into a single spinal nerve. Spinal nerves are classified as mixed nerves because they contain both sensory, or afferent, and motor, or efferent fibers. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, each identified by its association with adjacent vertebrae. Cervical spinal nerves are associated with spinal nerves that exit the cervical spine, and lumbar spinal nerves are associated with spinal nerves that exit the lumbar spine. Each spinal nerve inferior to the first thoracic vertebrae takes its name from the vertebrae immediately superior to it. Thus, T1 emerges immediately inferior to the T1 vertebra. T2 emerges immediately inferior to the T2 vertebra. This arrangement continues all the way down through the lumbars and into the sacrum. The L4 spinal nerve exits just below the L4 vertebrae. This arrangement is different in the cervicals. The first cervical spinal nerve, which is C1, passes between the occiput and the first cervical vertebrae. Thus, the C1 spinal nerve exits just superior to the C1 vertebra. C2 exits above C2. A spinal nerve designated as C8 will exit just below the C7 vertebrae. Therefore, although there are only 7 cervical vertebrae, there are 8 cervical nerves.